Welcome to the Friends of Work podcast, the podcast about mastering emotional intelligence at work. In the coming weeks, the Friends of Work podcast with Aditoye will be bringing you even more exciting guests and events. To support this podcast and to learn more about our future plans, please go to patreon.com/friendsatwork. That is patreon.com/friendsatwork. Thank you.
You know, I feel like we in the military get a lot of thanks these days. That wasn't true during Vietnam and the Korean War, but the pendulum has gone the other way, and veterans these days do get a lot of thanks, and I appreciate that. And sometimes I'm embarrassed, to be quite honest, because even though I spent almost 2 years in Afghanistan myself.
That was Peter Cairns, an officer in the U.S. Army. Here's the rest of our conversation.
My name is Peter Cairns. I'm a resident currently of the state of Virginia, and I grew up in Maryland.
Awesome. So what do you do professionally?
I'm an officer in the United States Army.
Great. So I read up a bit about what you do. I kind of know you're in the Army and you have all this interesting expertise. So can you talk a bit more about those things, like, you know, what your academic qualifications are, and what do you do for the Army?
Yeah, sure thing. I can give you a little bit of an idea of how I got here. So I started doing my undergraduate degree, bachelor's, at Wheaton College, Illinois, Christian College, just outside of Chicago. I did ROTC while I was there, which means that I went into the Army immediately following it on active duty. I spent about 5 years in the Army as an artillery officer. That means cannons, basically, that shoot relatively long range. And I was based out of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, which is the home of the 82nd Airborne Division. So that means that I jumped out of planes, and we threw the cannons out of planes, and we jumped out and went and found them. I spent about a year and a half.
Wait, are you serious? You jump out of planes, but you threw the cannons out, and then you went and found them by jumping out of planes?
Well, yeah, it's all coordinated in advance, but you definitely want to throw the cannons out first and then jump on top of them rather than having them fall on top of you.
Wow. Okay. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I spent a year and a half in Afghanistan while I was on active duty for a little while before I got out after about 4.5, almost 5 years on active duty. I got off active duty in about 2009 time frame, and then I went back to graduate school. So I went back and got a law degree and a master's in public policy, both from schools in Maryland. And then I came back to the Army, and I'm what's called an activated guardsman for the time being. I kept up my relationship with the National Guard, kind of doing the weekend warrior, weekend a month, and then 2 weeks in the summer sort of deal while I was in school. And then when I got out of graduate school, they kind of hired me on to these temporary orders that I'm on now. So I'm on 3-year temporary orders at the Pentagon, where I work in Congressional Affairs.
That sounds awesome. I mean, so the way I see it, you have 1 foot in the military and 1 foot in civilian life, or is that a wrong perspective of that?
No, that's exactly right. And there's actually a lot of going back and forth. It's nice that my career tends to synergize those two things. That's not true for everybody in the Guard or Reserves, but for me, that's worked out pretty well.
Someone like me does not know a lot about the U.S. military, except what the movies show us and news that you read here and there. And so, just talking about the military culture and emotional intelligence, can you speak a bit to some of the skills that the military teaches in, say, self-management?
Self-management, yeah, sure. The United States military is one of the world's largest bureaucracies. So in any bureaucracy, you're going to have a fair amount of overhead, but a lot of rules as well to kind of help manage things that you, the people and the assets and the different equipment that you might have. As far as self-management goes, I'm a big fan of Google Calendar, and my Google Calendar or my Outlook calendar, if I don't have it on there, I don't know what I'm doing the next moment. So I make sure to keep that up to date. A couple other things that, at least in leadership, the Army likes to teach is the idea of backwards planning. I don't know that that's unique to the military necessarily, but the idea of if you have a deadline, starting with that and giving yourself some kind of road marks along the way that you have to hit in order to make sure you make it to that timeline. So rather than just kind of piling them all up front, staggering your way towards when you know the mission needs to be, or the task needs to be accomplished. Another neat skill is the idea, what the military calls anyway, the 1/3, 2/3 rule. Okay. So if you get a task and you have some folks that are working for you, you can just, one technique is to take that task and then just turn it around and then delegate it immediately. What I think the military tends to teach you to do is take 1/3 of that time for yourself to help kind of think about what the task is, what the best way is to go about doing it, and then give 2/3 of that time to those underneath you. So in my case, that would be other soldiers or other officers, but that could make sense in the corporate world as well. So if you have an hour, you take 20 minutes to think about how it's best to go about it, and then you give 40 minutes to the guys who work for you. Or if you have a month, then you take a third of that time to yourself to formulate the best way forward.
It's awesome. I'm definitely going to take that. It sounds a little like something I heard once about measure twice, cut once kind of thing. You take your time to actually plan. You don't jump into the task just because you know what it is that you need to do, but you take some extra time out to have a clear plan, and so that when you execute, you're executing as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, I think that's definitely half of it, and the other half, of course, is that you're not going to take up all the time yourself. That you provide sufficient time for your subordinates to go forth and do the thing that you're asking them to do. So if you have a perfect plan, it doesn't mean anything if you don't give your folks enough time to do it. So maybe a mediocre plan with enough time to do it is better than the perfect plan at the last minute.
So in light of the hierarchical structure where it's a yes, sir, this is what are my orders, I'm going to execute, does the relationship between hierarchies influence actions that need to be taken? Yeah,
I think I get what you're getting at. I think I certainly there's a form of emotional intelligence that's always endemic to leadership, but I would say that the type of emotional intelligence or IQ that they foster in the military may not be the typical emotional intelligence that you may be referring to in the corporate culture. It may not be the traditional, because that's not very high necessarily on your list of attributes, because you're right. There are other skills that soldiers in the military need to be able to have, right? They're more kind of hardened skills like leadership and resilience. The ability to follow orders in the most trying of circumstances are certainly, I would consider to be forms of emotional intelligence, even if they aren't necessarily social in the same ways that you might see in a corporate boardroom or something like that. But leadership in general is certainly an important skill in the military that the military trains and teaches, and is an important skill that people come away from it with. The ability to read a crowd, prioritize requirements, and then make tough decisions, even when people don't like you for it. Those are all things that an emotionally aware leader needs to be able to do. And yes, soldiers have to learn and be ready to respond. They've got to be able to trust their commander to make the right decision in a life and death situation. You can't have a private questioning the order of one of his sergeants in the face of fire or combat, because other people's lives are on the line if he doesn't do it, right? He's got to step out and do what he's told. So I would say that's another form of emotional intelligence, even if it doesn't necessarily ring true like some of the other more traditional forms.
Yeah, I mean, soldiers in combat are actually, life and death situations. So it's definitely, in most other situations in life outside the military, it's not as dire as, standing in front of a bullet.
Yeah, and of course that doesn't happen very often, but they still have to have the capacity for that, right? You can't be questioning your commander back in the barracks here at home and then expect them to follow the orders when you're there in combat. So it's got to be trained kind of throughout the process.
So is there any room for dissent at all? Is there a formal process for dissent?
The people think about the military as being rather monolithic. And, the early stages, as people are entering at the beginning, that's probably true in large part. But I think as you rise through the ranks, senior leaders tend to value more of the outside the box thinking and kind of the additional benefits that enablers bring to a mission or to whatever you're trying to do. That said, I think chain of command is something that is highly valued in the military. So you still are expected to offer those through the formal chain of command. You never want to leap over your bosses or your boss's bosses and get out of line in that sense.
Sounds tough. It sounds tough. As somebody who hasn't been trained specifically in that, it feels like this is something that has to be taught over an extended period of time for soldiers to get into that mode. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it definitely is, and I think that's part of the reason you start with folks so young, right? You start recruiting, sometimes high schoolers are coming in at age 17, 18, and you send them to boot camp, and that's what it's all about. You kind of break them down in order to build them back up again as competent members of a team. And that's a great thing, as well as kind of, I understand why it kind of looks difficult or harsh from the outside, but that membership in a team and camaraderie is an important aspect of what the military stands for.
There's always this talk about the bond of brotherhood and just that camaraderie. What do you think is directly responsible for this? I think you've touched a bit on that. And do you think this is a transferable skill to the business world?
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think the military, I'll speak to the Army for the most part, but there are certainly a large range of kind of shared values that the military tends to teach, the Army tends to teach. Loyalty, duty, honor, respect, integrity and selfless service, personal courage. These are all things that are kind of drilled into you at all times. So a shared set of values, I think, is important. That's not just kind of lip service, but is actually something that's trained and then taught and then kind of inculcated by soldiers, by officers as well. So shared values, I think there's a real sense of a shared mission and common experience, whether that's traumatic or otherwise in the military as well. And that helps to create kind of an organizational structure that contributes to these kind of heightened senses of teamwork and bonds that are made in those, when you watch the movies, and that's relatively true in real life as well. Of course, it's glamorized in the movies, but certainly the more shared experiences you have like that, the more you are formed, the more you are gelled into being similar, and you have more things to relate upon, right? So even if you don't look like or sound like the other person, you have this shared knowledge base of what the other person has been through and what you guys both share. If I meet somebody from the Navy or the Air Force, I do immediately kind of know that I share a military bond with them. But the closer you get to my unit, if you get to the Army or you get to the 82nd Airborne or even my battalion or platoon that I was a part of when I was more closer to the ground, that bond gets tighter and tighter, right? Because you share so many things together.
A shared set of values. You feel like that's the heart of this bond that holds soldiers together in their unit, right?
Yeah, values and shared experiences. Because just about everybody has to go to basic training, and certainly once you've been to war with people, that exists. Yeah,
I guess that is true for soldiers and non-soldiers too. People who've been through and people who have shared trauma tend to bond together quickly.
Yeah, I think that definitely translates into emotional intelligence as well, right? If you've gone through a difficult experience, getting fired or getting broken up with, or being cheated on, right? You tend to kind of share the same. You can empathize with other folks who have been through similar experiences, and I think that creates an immediate bond that may not have been there otherwise.
I'm just probing here for many things that I haven't had the opportunity to ever ask somebody in the military, right? And
okay, let's go.
So, in the light of the MeToo movement, right, and Time's Up, and especially with women in the military and some of the stories that come out in the media, and unfortunately, the worst stories get to be the glamorized ones or the ones that we hear about. How is this movement affecting the military, if at all? And I like asking two-part questions so that you probably can answer them together. And the second part is, does this, in your experience or expertise, affect national security in any way?
Well, the first part of that question is a little bit easier. We'll see if I can get the other. For those not familiar, the military has its own sort of military legal system. So in addition to the normal legal system that we all live under, state and federal laws, the military has what's called the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the UCMJ. And this is another kind of book of regulations that military commanders and chains of command have. It's a literal legal authority over their soldiers. And so there's tremendous discretion that exists there that doesn't exist in any sort of civilian capacity, right? So a commander can dock the pay of one of his subordinates. He or she can restrict you to quarters. A Navy commander can lock you in a room on the ship, throw you in the brig where you can only eat bread for up to a month at a time. So these are rather strong powers that don't exist elsewhere. And unfortunately, I think it's true that, as in any kind of large bureaucracy, that sort of power can be abused and does get abused from time to time. And unfortunately, we've definitely seen a number of generals and admirals and lower-ranking commanders get caught up in sexual harassment scandals. Many have been fired over the past 5 to 7 years. And actually, I think the military was a little bit ahead of the MeToo movement, to be quite honest, in making amendments and changes to the UCMJ to go after widespread sexual harassment problems within the military. So I'm not going to say it's perfect. It certainly is not, because people are getting caught and being having complaints every day. And it's probably better to ask females in the military than it is to ask me where we stand on things right now. But for what it's worth, I think we're on a positive trajectory, and things are getting better, even if there are still, unfortunately, kind of some of those sorts of things still do happen.
So the second part of that, what kind of impact do you potentially see on national security with this sort of situation?
I mean, so there's no excuse for it back here. There's no excuse for it, period. But certainly when you're back here in America, you're not deployed, there should always be zero tolerance. Not to say that it's okay overseas, but when you're overseas, and like we were talking about earlier, when you're in combat, the mission sometimes does take precedence over other things that are going on. Which is not to say that sexual harassment is ever okay, but sometimes you only have so much time in a day as a leader of what you're going to emphasize, prioritize, and if you're in literal combat, and taking fire and things like that, and then recovering afterwards, there may not be that sort of time to prioritize protecting against that sort of thing. And to be quite honest, I think that's part of the reason why, for decades and decades of our nation's history, until very recently, it's only been men that have been allowed on the front lines. So men habitually have been the only folks allowed in combat arms in the past. And of course, that changed a couple of years ago under President Obama. One of the last things he did in his last 1 or 2 years was to open up all those combat arms to females, special forces to females. I mean, I won't pretend like that's not going to cause conflict. I think it was a bit of a social experiment on his part. And, of course, it sounds great, right? Equality and equity and all these things. But it definitely creates friction and sexual tension in places where it can be dangerous for soldiers to have that sort of tension, and where it didn't necessarily exist in the same way in the past.
Thank you for that insight. I hadn't even, thought about it from that perspective. Well, like I said, I am a novice in this matters, but that was a good insight. So I like how you brought, President Obama into it, because it kind of dovetails into the next question that I'm going to ask, which is, are political views encouraged or discouraged in the military?
So military members are supposed to remain apolitical, especially while they're in uniform. Senior leaders do their best to kind of remain focused on tactical, operational, strategic military issues, leaving policy decisions and politics to civilians, right? That's part of the reason we have civilian leadership of our military. We have a Secretary of Defense who's a civilian, a nominated political civilian who sits atop the Department of Defense and over all all the generals, admirals that we have in the military. So in any official capacity, a military member, a uniformed member, is supposed to remain apolitical. That doesn't mean that military members aren't allowed to have personal opinions, aren't allowed from kind of participating in political rallies or supporting their own Democratic candidates. They just are not allowed to present themselves as this is the military answer on this topic, right? Like, you can't come out and endorse President Trump or Hillary Clinton as a military member. You can't say this is the military's advocating for any particular issue, for for or against guns being regulated, for or against marijuana, for or against a Democratic candidate.
As a uniformed military officer, you're not allowed to speak to any one of those issues, even if you have personal opinions about them.
No, don't get me wrong. You're not allowed to present your opinion as if it is the military's perspective.
Oh, okay.
And so if you show up in uniform at, say, a rally for Senator X, that seems to be an endorsement of the military of Senator X, right? Mm-hmm. So you're not supposed to do that. And you're not supposed to go up there and say, I'm a major in the Army and I think this guy's great. You can go up there and say, my name is Peter and I think this guy is great, or this girl is great, but not because you are a military member and not as like a condoning of this person as from the military.
I get that. And so, as we round off this conversation, I want to ask your opinion. So I'm asking Peter Cairns now, since I cannot ask Major Peter Cairns this question.
Yeah, that's true.
What's your opinion about arming school teachers?
Right, so my personal opinion on it, and I've appreciated what you've done these past couple of weeks with the concentration on women at work during the month of March. I listened to a number of your previous podcasts, and the emphasis on teachers is important. I think they are vastly underappreciated and underpaid in our culture.
Almost in any culture, teachers are usually not paid what they're worth.
Yeah, that's probably true, right? So it's crazy that we don't value the people who are raising the next generation. But all that said, I think that teachers are designed to be educators, right? They're not there to be a layer of extra defense. And of course, I would, if I was a teacher, I would hope that I would be there and I would jump in front of a kid who is going to get injured. But I don't think that the teachers should be the ones that are primarily responsible for defending physically their students. They're there to be educators, and that's what they should be concentrating on.
I heard someone say that if people started bombing churches, should they arm priests? And I heard that from a teacher, and I thought that was really poignant in the way she put it. And so, well, I'm in agreement with you, but it's good to have your opinion on this also, especially as someone whose part of your duty is to carry a weapon, right? So, and it's good to hear you say that it's not necessarily the good thing for school teachers to also be police officers on top of all the other responsibilities that they have to take on in the current educational system.
I do agree with that. And another underappreciated segment of our population are cops and first responders. They put their lives. I feel like we in the military get a lot of thanks these days. That wasn't true during Vietnam and the Korean War, but the pendulum has gone the other way, and veterans these days do get a lot of thanks, and I appreciate that. And sometimes I'm embarrassed, to be quite honest, because even though I spent almost 2 years in Afghanistan myself, cops every single day here in America put their lives on the line. Every time they pull over somebody in a car, they don't know what's going to come out at them, or if they approach another dangerous situation, and they too are underappreciated. But they are the ones domestically who should be carrying weapons and making sure that people, that places and schools are safe. Certainly not the military, and definitely more so than teachers.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can support this podcast by going to patreon.com/friendsatwork. That's patreon.com/friendsatwork. You can also reach me by email at myfriendtoye@gmail.com. My Facebook page is Friends at Work Podcast, and my Twitter handle is at Friends at Work US. Join me next time for another episode of Friends at Work Podcast with Ade Toye. Bye for now.